Moving on to the fourth class of the skill guide series, we have the Assassin, Mistress of Traps, Martial Artist Extraordinaire, and Queen of the Shadows, not to mention one of the more complex and interesting characters from the roster. Though starting out, let's get some of her more straightforward tools out of the way, starting with the fire traps, namely Fire Blast, Wake of Fire, and Wake of Inferno, each of which has a use case, but some more so than others. Starting at the bottom and working our way up, we have Wake of Inferno. Sadly, the least utilized skill of the trio, this is a trap that does exactly what it says on the tin. It uses Inferno, which at first glance seems like a great idea for a trap, but in the end, the only real advantage of this trap is the fact that there is an area of effect on it that is not affected by pits in the environment, meaning it can shoot airborne enemies over chasms and rivers. This advantage is quickly lost whenever you look at its downsides though, so you'll be generally only finding this on, well, characters that uses a synergy about 90% of the time, with the other 10% dealing with pesky flyers that won't go where other fire traps can hit. This is because Wake of Inferno suffers from many of the same problems that the Sorcerer's Inferno does, a stationary platform firing slow-moving missiles at a moving target. And since it's an AI-controlled fire, it fires at the enemy where it is, not where they will be, so many of these missiles end up wasted. Now, when it does hit, it does okay damage, and it can be used on an assassin that is able to hold the target still, but generally, those types of builds will favor self-delivered damage over a tool like this. The more favored fire trap, at least as far as the deployable ones, is the lower level Wake of Fire, which does reasonable damage for a level 12 skill and does it over a broader area but is constrained due to being a ground only skill, so it can't hit anything over a river or a void. But it is much more efficient for dealing with the majority of enemies in this game. Due to its larger area of effect, it can blanket entire areas with fire, meaning wasted shots are far less common, and it tends to do much better against crowds, especially since as it gains levels, the range of the attack increases. Now, both these traps so far share some properties. You can only have a total of 5 traps out at any given time, regardless of the combinations you use. The speed you drop them at is limited by your attack speed, and the boosts such as +% fire damage or -% enemy fire resistance do not apply to them. So don't waste time with a Phoenix Shield if you are doing a just fire trap build. The big advantage on traps though is that they are one of the few remaining corner shot skills in the game, meaning yes, you have to drop the trap in your own line of sight, but the trap targets based on its own line of sight, meaning it can be used to hit things that you yourself cannot see, which is excellent for personal safety. And a little post edit here since it's a bit of a common question, yes, shadow summons of traps count against your limit of 5 total, and if you over summon, your oldest trap will always be the first one to go away. Now, the deviant of the fire traps out of all of this though is Fire Blast, the direct fire trap of the group, which breaks some of the rules of the droppable traps, but not others. Like its deployable friends, its speed is based on your attack speed, and you can only throw it in line of sight. The difference is, this deals damage on landing rather than putting out a trap, and since it's a self-cast ability rather than a summon ability, it actually does benefit from +% fire damage and -% enemy fire resist. On top of this, it synergizes with a ton of things, making it a prime choice for being a second elemental form of damage in late game lightning trap builds as well. So, do you enjoy playing trap assassins, or are you more of a martial artist? Do you wish there were more synergies between the two? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members and patrons that make this content possible. Continuing the trap tree, we have the lightning branch sitting over here on the left, and where fire is used in the early game, trap assassins tend to favor lightning in the late game due to the fact that it's resisted less overall and its immunities are far easier to break. This is especially important since for both fire and lightning traps, only 2 of them get any benefits beyond plus skills from your gear. So today we're going to look at the 3 pure lightning traps, Shockweb, Chargebolt Sentry, and Lightning Sentry, since we already covered the split damage trap, Death Sentry in its own video earlier, that you'll find linked at the end. Though, on the pure lightning front, let's start with Shockweb. This skill is often dismissed, but is actually an interesting tool more in line with Fire Blast, since due to being a self-cast and direct damage, you do benefit from your equipment, with things such as Rest in Peace, +% lightning damage, and even -% enemy lightning resists working with this skill. And while it has a massive next delay, preventing it from piling on a single target super hard, it is still useful as a landmine to drop among your other normal traps when targets are not lightning immune. soon. The way this skill functions is you essentially throw out a series of lightning grenades that spark on the ground for a few seconds and damage enemies that walk through them, and with higher levels as well as more points in Fire Blast, you end up stacking quite a few of these missiles, allowing it to hit a fairly wide area, though as a ground-based attack it still will only hit enemies that cannot go across rivers and chasms. As far as damage, it follows the unfortunate lightning rule of synergies only affecting maximum damage, so it will lower the average damage, but you will still get some impressive maximum damage for what it is. Now, in the more traditional trap forms, we'll start with the Charged Bolt Trap, which functions much like its sorceress counterpart, firing a volley of multiple charged bolts out at the enemy at the nearest to the trap, with bolts provided by the Shockwave synergy, allowing it to stack damage a bit better, though even at point blank, and even though the lightning from these traps can all hit the same target, it generally will not compare to its bigger siblings on the sorceress or even the Amazon, but they're still better than people will likely acknowledge due to it being eclipsed by its big brother. Now, as with all deployed traps, it sadly will not benefit from the lightning boost on your character, with neither +% lightning damage or -% lightning resist affecting the damage of these traps, which is one of the primary reasons it struggles so much compared to the Charge Bolt equivalent on the other classes, since they can benefit from this effect. Now, speaking of the Big Brother Lightning Sentry, we have easily the most commonly used trap in the game, and while individually it lacks the punch of Sorceress Lightning, and it still has the same penalty of other lightning skills with a minimum damage lock, as well as the penalty of other deployed traps with its lack of functionality with the % boost effects, it still has massive advantage thanks to the corner shots by placing it far away, as well as being able to deploy 5 of them very quickly to focus down targets. And while similar to Death Sentry, this will be your most common trap even in the late game assassins, with most players favoring either a 3-2 split or even a 4-1 split with Death Sentry for dealing with crowds effectively. And with the significantly longer awareness range of lightning traps compared to say Death Sentry or the fire traps, it is weirdly better positioned for dealing with threats before they ever get near the assassin. And while these skills don't benefit from the % effects from equipment, they still benefit if a party member is using Conviction to lower the resist of the enemies, since lightning resists are some of the easiest to break in the game. So combining this with an Infinity Mercenary in the very late game is one of the most commonly used tricks. Now, if you want to know more about the other elemental traps, you will find links to them on screen now, with the one on the left leading you to the more fire traps, and the one on the right showing off the corpse exploding skills of the Death Sentry. And as always, a special thanks to the patrons that help keep this channel afloat. The first of many weird complexities in the Assassin skill tree starts with the blade branch of the trap tree. This is because they have multiple layers of functionality and oddly specific lists of what they can and cannot trigger or carry with them during use. Though at least it's fairly consistent on where it sources its damage from, which is your primary weapon, and that they all get pretty much the smaller bonus percentage-wise from two-handers than one-handers. Though it can get a bit fiddly with dual wielding, but it will always take your primary weapon, which is a video in and of itself, even though it is usually, and I have to say usually here, your glove side weapon. Now, starting at the top and working our way down, we have the only deployable blade trap, Blade Sentry, a spinning trap that patrols a region for several seconds, dealing damage to any enemies that pass through it, with their damage provided both by the skill itself, but also the weapon you're wielding, as we said earlier. And in 2.4, both of these values got a fairly significant boost, and even got combined with synergies in the other blade skills. The only real drawback of it is that it has a fairly long next delay on damage, meaning stacking them up on a single target does not work too well, so it's often better to spread them out to harm the crowd instead. Now, as far as what is carried along with the Sentry, it carries attack rating boost, critical strike effects, elemental damage, and durations, as well as the basics like minimum and maximum damage, as well as % damage increases, though nothing else. So you won't ever get a chance to cast, leech, or even damage plus modifier on it, and of course most of this is affected by the skill's damage penalty. On the plus side though, for this and Fury, your % damage increases such as Fanaticism, Fortitude, etc. are applied to the plus damage on the skill itself, so you can get into some pretty solid damage outputs even if the character screen does not accurately show them. This is also true of the favorite skill of the batch, as we said, Blade Fury, which, being a direct cast skill, can do a lot more in terms of functionality, while following many of the same rules as its deployable counterpart, at least whenever it comes to how the % penalties work. The nice thing about it being a direct attack, though, is that despite locking you in place like Inferno does, it carries on it many more of the useful features you'll find on normal ranged physical attacks. This includes leeching, open wounds, crushing blow, freeze, blind, slow, not to mention knockback, knockback, minus enemy resist, ignore target defense, rest in peace, mana and life per kill, and a plethora of other abilities. To the point where it's almost quicker to list what it does not provide, with two of the most unfortunate exclusions being things like the damage plus you find on grief and the chance to cast on attack effect, though you do get chance to cast on striking and kill with it. Probably the nicest thing about Blade Fury though is that it does all this while pairing with a more caster-oriented playstyle, since neither attack rate or casting speed affect the rate at which you throw the stars after windup, meaning all you need to do is focus on boosting that damage and getting trigger effects with it. And unlike many other range attacks, this doesn't hurt your weapon durability, meaning you can even do this with ethereal weapons, which makes it able to be quite punchy at a range. Now, the same cannot be said for number 3, Blade Shield, since it can break weapons. So don't use it if you're running an ethereal Blade Fury setup, just trust me, it won't be good. But if you are going with more traditional weapons, it can be pretty interesting as a tool, though it also breaks a few of the rules for the previous skills and straddles the middle ground in what it carries on it compared to the other two. Basically, it can use all the functions of Blade Sentinel, but it also provides Leech, Prevent Monster Heal, plus % elemental damage, minus enemy resists, target defense modifiers, and is the only Blade skill that can use the damage plus effect from things like Grief, or the chance to cast on attack effects, though it will only trigger on a successful attack. The weirdest quirk for it though is that unlike the other two Blade skills, Shield does not get the % damage boost from its skill damage, so it will do quite a bit less than other options, especially if you're built up for them. Some other things to remember about Blade Shield though is that the damage is based on the weapon you're wielding when it hits, not when you cast it. And while Blade Shield triggers in melee range, it is not affected by your weapon range. So a dagger with it will have the same range as a polearm, which does fly counter to a lot of other skill functionality in the game. There are some semi-exploitable things you can do with spam casting the skill, but due to the high cost of Blade Shield, it's going to be a bit too expensive to do it for long. Overall, the Blade skills are severely underestimated and can wreck some serious nonsense when used properly. So do you use them, or are they outside your comfort zone? Mention them down below, and be sure to check out some of the other more popular traps on screen now, and of course, a special thanks to channel members, patrons, and viewers like you for making this content possible. Today, we have our second split class video as we talk about what are often considered the must-have skills for their respective classes, Corpse Explosion and Death Sentry, which have a few mechanics that most players may not know about and are still two of the strongest skills in the game, despite the fact that Corpse Explosion is one of the most nerfed skills in the game, and Death Sentry itself has received a few nerfs recently as well. Starting with the Explosion, since it is the cornerstone of both skills, we have skills that deal damage based on a % of the enemy's normal base life. So, for example, its damage will not be boosted if you explode the corpse of a higher life version of the monster, such as a champion, compared to a normal monster, that is. This also means that it won't do scaling damage with more players in the game, so it will be a little slower but still strong on players 8 than it is on players 1. And this applies to both Death Sentry and Corpse Explosion, even though the percents do differ. And there is actually another unmentioned damage penalty tied to these skills as well, where if your character level is lower than the enemy level, it will do reduced damage based on what % of the monster's level you are. So for example, if you're level 60 and a Corpse Explode a level 80 monster, your explosion will only do about 75% of the damage it would normally deal due to the level difference. Beyond that, we have a few quirks to keep in mind as well, such as how the fire damage radius and the physical damage radius are calculated separately, and while they match up on odd levels for both skills, the fire radius is actually slightly higher on even numbered levels, which will rarely be an issue, but is the reason why some people have issues regarding enemies at the edge of the skill's range when dealing with immunities. And the last little bit about the Explosion to remember is how it's treated by plus fire skills, fire damage boosters, and minus enemy fire resist effects. Starting with fire skills, Corpse Explosion itself is considered a fire skill, while Death Sentry is not, so only Corpse Explosion gets a boost from stuff like Mage Fist. Now, plus % fire damage, like what you find on Rainbow Facets or with Fire Mastery, do not work on either of them, so the only way to increase the fire or physical damage above base is by reducing the enemy resistances through things like Conviction, Lower Resist, Amplify Damage, etc. Now, for the Necromancer Corpse Explosion, that's going to be about it, since regardless of level, it will deal 70 to 120% of the enemy's base life as damage, with half of it being physical and the other half being fire. So the main thing you're going to gain with putting points into it is going to be increased radius, which, depending depending on where or what you farm, it may be a waste of points, but you'll often find people recommending high levels in it due to open farming areas like cows and Chaos Sanctuary. With Death Sentry though, we have a little more in the way of things to consider. This is because it's a bit more layered of a skill, with lightning damage as an attack when no corpses are present, a summon limit of 5, and a bit lower of a percent damage to compensate for this of 40 to 80% to be precise. Though it also has a slightly larger radius than the standard corpse explosion as well, but not enough to be an issue, and of course it does 50% fire, 50% physical on the corpse explosions, just like corpse explosion itself. As far as how the lightning and corpse explosions work, the lightning actually gets a longer range by extending the life of the lightning projectile as it levels up, though it can still only target things within its range of awareness, and it will only do corpse explosions to damage enemies within this range of awareness too, so you can pretty much assume if there's a corpse that can hit something, it will use it. Otherwise, it's just a weaker lightning sentry, and will play that way all the time, especially with 2.4 lowering its synergy potential as a pseudo nerf, so it can't really backfeed as many benefits to the skills that you use alongside it. Overall, both of these skills are still exceptionally strong and are staples of pretty much every build in their class for a reason, especially considering how few points they need to be effective. So do you enjoy using them, or do you prefer avoiding these somewhat overplayed skills? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the patrons, channel members, and Twitch subs that make this content possible. With the traps done, it's time we move into the shadow skills of the assassin, the main assassin tree that everyone should be using in one form or another, regardless of their core build, with today's focus being the support skills, Burst of Speed, Fade, and Venom, all three of which are extremely powerful tools in the right hands, though in the case of Venom, it does all kinds of weird mumbo-jumbo to the poison formula as well. Starting with Burst of Speed, the skill of choice for many speedrunners for obvious reasons, it is still a powerful skill for normal players as well, thanks to providing two highly desired bonuses: increased movement speed and increased attack speed. Though it does have the drawback of being exclusive to the Fade skill, which we'll get to in a moment, so you'll have to choose one or the other to lean into. Now, the reason Burst of Speed is so popular is due to the fact that not only does it help melee and martial artist assassins for obvious reasons, but also because the vast majority of assassin skills rely on attack speed to determine how quickly they're used, with the only exceptions being certain ones in the shadow tree, and of course off-class ones like teleport or lower resist. So this massive buff to it makes sense even for many trappers outside of maybe Bladesons. Now, Fade, the other side of the coin, greatly improves your durability, so you sort of have to choose whether survivability or speed is your needed flavor, and Fade adds a ton of survivability, with a fairly significant boost to resists, as well as physical damage reduction and curse duration reduction. Though, it is important to remember, curse reduction directly impacts shrine duration as well, so if you're grabbing experience shrines for the race to 99, for example, wait until after you get the shrine to pop Fade, since it only affects the duration if Fade was up prior to grabbing it. For both Fade and Burst of Speed, it is important to remember that they follow a last cast override, so there are situations where you might accidentally end up overriding a strong cast with a weaker cast if you're a neurotic recaster and use a bunch of plus skills on your swap. Though if you're running even a basic amount of plus skills on your main, you'll usually be fine due to diminishing returns in both regards, with the only non-diminishing aspect being Fade's damage reduction percent, which is a flat 1% per level and is the reason Treachery is such a sought-after budget armor. Now, our last skill, as we mentioned earlier, is the odd one out of the bunch and sets us on the tip of a much more complex iceberg, and that is Venom, one of the weirdest skills in the game since it changes how an entire element works while in effect. But on the basic end, Venom basically gives you poison damage of an okay amount over a very short span of time, while turning your weapons green unless you have some other effect active. And to clear out a common misconception, no, Venom is not exclusive against any other skills. It is perfectly fine to have it running alongside Fade and Enchant, and you also don't have to worry about things like Grief overriding it, since Venom is a highest skill wins function, so level 20 Venom will not be overridden by level 15 Venom. Now, where Venom gets weird is that, in a way, it condenses poison. So basically it forces all non-skill poison to adhere to its 0.4 second duration. So all of your poison gear will have its bit rates, which is roughly what determines its damage per second, applied over the 0.4 second duration, regardless of how many sources you have or their individual durations. So it bypasses a lot of the complexity of the formula. This, however, does not apply to skill poison. So Venom plus Poison Dagger, for example, will use Poison Dagger's duration and pair it with the new condensed Venom poison, with its super short duration, creating a poison attack that is only marginally longer than Poison Dagger's listed duration, but has pretty decent damage per second. Now, as far as how Venom works outside the scope of Poison Dagger and Poison Javelin, it works just like any other poison skill, just with a really short duration that forces other sources to comply. This makes it much more useful for application through stuff like Blade Shield, various attacks and charge ups, and even application by bow for a weirder build that we might get to eventually, and it can be handy. Though it is worth noting that Venom itself is only enough to be supplementary damage, though if you have points to spare, it can speed things up a lot and give you some solid support against things like physical immunes. Now, we could deep dive into poison here, but due to the complexity of it, that would probably be better in a video of its own. So which of the support skills do you prefer using on an assassin, and why? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to all the patrons that make this content possible. Moving to the other side of the Assassin Shadow Tree, we have the utility skills, Psychic Hammer, Mind Blast, and Cloak of Shadows. And while they may seem fairly simple at first glance, each one has its own little slice of interesting mechanics that defines so many of the assassin skills. Starting at the foundation, we have Psychic Hammer, easily the least used of the three skills, but one that follows an intriguing set of rules that can give it a little fun edge. Starting with the targeting, which has a handful of odd rules. Starting at the most basic, it will only actually cast if there's a target available for it. You may think this requires having an enemy under the cursor, but it does not. Instead, Psychic Hammer will target the closest enemy to the cursor within a fairly decent radius. And while the damage is extremely weak, this skill has a few edges over its nearest cousin, Telekinesis, in that it has a 100% knockback chance against normal and minion monsters, and a quickly scaling chance of knocking back champions, uniques, and even bosses and players, passing 75% for both by level 10. The last odd quirk for Psychic Hammer is its damage, which is actually split physical and magical, half and half, which, if they ever increase the damage potential of it, could make it a much more interesting and integral skill than it is now. Though we do have other options for the ranged spell effects in the Assassin Shadow Tree with the ever popular Mind Blast, which, despite being pure physical and losing the knockback of its smaller cousin, packs in a lot more interesting tools, gaining an area of effect the size of a fireball, as well as picking up stun and conversion effects, and was strong enough to be part of a broken PvP combo for quite a while due to the stun effect, though that's a discussion for another video. Now, it goes without saying that the damage from Mind Blast is, well, garbage, but the control aspects of it make it a strong skill to get out of tight situations. Just make sure you don't stick around after converted enemies have kind of changed over, if you have strong auras at least, since it can take up to 2 seconds for them to expire after the conversion effect drops. If you do want more details on the conversion effect itself and how it affects monster levels and experience, there will be a link to the Paladin skill it's based on at the end of the video. The third skill that sits smack dab in the middle of the other two is Cloak of Shadows, and my personal favorite of the three because it is a skill every assassin build can use, from trappers using it to stay away from attacks, to martial assassins using it to bypass enemy defenses while boosting their own. The effects of Cloak of Shadows is a weird mix of things. First is the curse effect that takes the form of rising smoke that blinds enemies within the radius and drastically reduces their defense, up to 95%, capping out at level 28. And while it can apply to a lot of enemies, even curse immune ones, the blind is still affected by the AI curse limitation of only affecting normal and minion monsters, but the minus defense will work on all enemies except for bosses. The other effect is a percent boost to the assassin's defense, which, while not a massive amount compared to other defense boosts, is still somewhat useful. The somewhat annoying quirk of Cloak of Shadows, likely due to its group of effects, is that once you cast, you won't be able to recast it to refresh its effect until it's completed its duration, which is oddly more frustrating at higher levels of the skill than at lower levels, since you'll often be waiting upwards of 20 or 30 seconds per cast, and may have already encountered multiple packs of enemies in that time, while only being able to affect one group of them. But overall, it's still quite powerful in pretty much every assassin build you can think of. So, are you a Mind Blast fanatic, or are you more of a Cloak of Shadows fan? Mention it down below, and check out the conversion video on screen now for how Mind Blast conversion affects enemy levels and experience. Now it's time to dive into the central path of the Shadow Tree, where we can find an odd mix of tools, with 2 combat passives in the form of Claw Mastery and Weapon Block, and 2 summons with the form of Shadow Warrior and Shadow Master. And with the exception of Claw Mastery, each of these follows the assassin pattern of having some pretty fun quirks about them that most people do not expect. Though, to get that simple one out of the way, Claw Mastery is just like any other weapon mastery, it's just limited to claws. It provides a boost to damage and attack rating and gives a chance of mastery-based critical strike, which is separate from equipment-based sources. As far as one of the more common questions about the mastery though, yes, its damage boost applies to Blade Fury, though its attack rating boost does not. Now, on to the more interesting stuff. Let's take care of the passive Weapon Block first. This only works when stationary or when using abilities like Whirlwind or Teleport that count as stationary mechanically, and it only works while your human assassin form is active and wielding dual claws. So no, it will not work if you are using Beast to turn into a bear. As far as why it's weird, it actually blocks a lot more things than normal blocking, so even though it will never get the same percent as a shield due to only getting percent block from the skill itself, it will block a lot more attacks total. Pretty much the only things it won't try to block at least part of are radial, retaliatory, or spawn on target damage effects like Psychic Hammer. It also is a bit finicky whenever it comes to charge attacks and smite, but most of those are going to be fringe cases you won't really run into unless you're really into PvP. The more complicated aspects of the central branch, though, are the summons, which oddly both have their own special uses, with Shadow Master being the far more generic one despite being higher level. This is because she's tankier in general due to far better equipment spawns that are much like the Valkyries. When the higher level she is, the better equipment she can spawn with, and her ability to use all the assassin skills is a pretty nice perk too, regardless of whether you invested in them or not. Yes, even the ones you don't actively put on your bar. This compared to the Shadow Warrior that is restricted to your active skills on your left and right click, and gets generally worse equipment due to limitations on what she can spawn with. That said, there are common myths about her, one of the biggest ones being her resists, since despite not being listed, she actually does get resists, though they cap out much lower than the Masters at 75% instead of 90%. Beyond this, both the Shadows have similar rules in that they both have scaling strength and dexterity, their item levels scale with their skill level, and that they both, most importantly, have skill memory and benefit from skill synergies. So until resummoned, she will remember the skills she has used, at the level she used them at, resulting in those skills synergizing with any other skill she uses. This can be used to generate super traps stronger than you can get yourself, though the more common use is to let her use specific traps at a stronger level than your current base build has. The Shadow's skill levels will be half of your current skill level rounded down, plus 1/3 of your Shadow's skill level when summoned, again rounded down, with a minimum of 1 and no maximum, and every skill level she has is counted as a hard point for her synergies. So if you have, for example, a level 30 Shadow Warrior and level 30 Fire Blast, she would cast Fire Blast at level 25. Now, saying you repeat that with level 30 Wake of Inferno and level 30 Wake of Fire, your Shadow Warrior would now have 25 hard points in Fire Blast and 2 synergies, meaning she may be casting Fire Blast at a slightly lower level than you, but she would have a whopping 10 more synergy points boosting it. That said, the more common use of this though is creating dummy traps with minimal skill investment. That said, it's important to remember her skill level in a skill always is determined by her last cast of it. So if you do pre-buff synergy traps, be sure not to swap back to old traps. You will still want your main trap to be high level while playing as well. So, do you have a favorite Shadow, and did you know that Warriors got resist too, despite the game lying to you? Mention it down below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. In the third and final assassin tree, the martial arts tree, there are some skills that have finally started to get some more love since the release of Resurrected's 2.4 patch. This is especially apparent in the charge skills. Starting on the left, we have the Claw exclusive skills though, Fists of Fire, Claws of Thunder, and Blades of Ice, the standalone elemental options. Starting out, it's important to know if you plan to use these skills, they will only charge up orbs by using claws, though they will expel their charges through any of the normal means, such as finishing moves or normal attacks with any weapon. And as of 2.4, it will expend single charges of each flavor, rather than the entirety of the 3 orbs, which makes these a lot more useful with the various skills at your disposal. The charges still only last 15 seconds from the last strike with the charge up skill though, so keep that in mind as this will make stacking more than a couple skills a bit of a pain. Starting at the top and working our way down, we have the fire elemental charges, Fist of Fire. At 1 charge, it merely converts some of the physical damage to fire while adding 50% attack rating and a pinch of extra flat fire damage for the finishing move. At the 2nd charge, it extends this to an area of an effect and gives your finishing move an extra 100% attack rating. And at the 3rd charge, it adds a burning effect and even more attack rating, 150% to be precise. Sadly, as a lower level skill, it does not quite reach the punch of the higher claw charge abilities without a really good weapon, but for leveling up as well as a tool for later synergies, it is still a pretty solid selection since it can easily take you into the levels leading up to skills like Phoenix Strike, which funnily enough feed back into this skill and actually make it a bit punchier. Though it is worth noting that in a weird mechanical decision, the damage per second effect is not aided by, well, +% fire damage effects. It only affects the direct fire damage and the explosion itself. Moving down the list, we have the lightning elemental option, Claws of Thunder. Similar to the fire option and, well, every other charge ability, it gets angrier with each charge, with the same attack rating boost per charge as Fist of Fire, but this time doing a slightly different attack pattern, with flat lightning damage added to the attack at 1 charge, though sadly no damage conversion effect, and then it does a release of Nova at 2 charges, and finally releases a radial series of charge bolts at the 3rd charge. And while they all sadly have the same 1 damage minimum as other lightning skills, they do get up to okay maximums. Now, as with Fist of Fire, the skill is usually used as a lead up to Phoenix Strike, though with its amount of damage on the skill itself, it is a little more solo self-found friendly than Fist of Fire, since it doesn't require stronger weapons to deal decent damage in its element. And personally, it's my favorite of the 3 elemental claws simply because it is useful, but it also works exceptionally well as a synergy for Phoenix Strike's 2nd charge. Though, unfortunately, this also has the issue of the percent damage effects only applying to the direct damage aspect of the skill rather than the rest of her abilities. The last of the claw exclusive charges is Blades of Ice, which, if it wasn't obvious, is the ice skill. You could probably tell by the name. And it's probably the most utilitarian of the bunch thanks to carrying with it the side effects of chill or even freeze, depending on what level you charge it up to. Since at 1 charge you just get chill and damage to a single target, at 2 charges you get chill and damage to a crowd, and at 3 charges you straight up freeze that crowd, with damage and cold length increasing as you gain levels in the skill, and you of course get the attack rating bonuses with each charge, same as with the other skills. Blades of Ice is also generally the more popular pure elemental option for dumping points in, mostly due to those freeze and chill effects that we mentioned earlier, and that its interaction with Phoenix Strike still boosts one of the stronger options for it, since the ice ability is a fairly powerful tool, even compared to the lightning one that I prefer. And if you are using a claw on your main, freezing enemies in place at the same time is pretty handy. Now you may be expecting Phoenix Strike here, but it's not claw exclusive, so that will be in our next martial arts video. Until then, check out the link on screen to find out more about the assassin support skills that can keep even solo self-found martial artists pushing forward even against bad odds and bad finds. Of course, as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. To continue the charge skills, it's time we look at the ones you can build up regardless of whether you choose claws, swords, or even bloody windhammer if you really wanted to. Pretty much the only thing you can't charge them with would be a bow. These skills tend to have more broad applications than their claw-exclusive counterparts, with general damage boosts from things like Tiger Strike, the leech potential of Cobra Strike, and the triple elemental threat of Phoenix Strike. Let's start with the most straightforward of the 3, Tiger Strike, which is pretty straightforward +% damage per charge effect. That, of course, only applies on the skill you use to release the charge. As of 2.4, this skill is a bit more useful though, thanks to the fact that it only expends single charges rather than the whole stack, when you use a finishing move with it, that is. Meaning you can use abilities like Dragon Talon with it and get a strong first strike, middle range second strike, and still boosted but weaker third strike from the Talon in quick succession. And the same goes for the double hits of Dragon Claw, or just hitting in sequences with a fast weapon. Though sadly, these percent damage boosts do only apply when you're applying a finishing move or normal attack, so don't treat them like an aura, but rather treat it as a boost to one of the series of the attacks. For percents, it's fairly straightforward. Each charge increases the damage of the hit by a fixed percent, so the third charge will do 3 times the damage and give 150% boost to attack rating for the finishing move, while the first charge will only do basic percent boost to damage and just a 50% boost to attack rating. The real perk of this skill comes from comboing it with other abilities or just big angry weapons. Moving down, we have sadly the least loved charge skill, Cobra Strike. This is the leech skill as we mentioned earlier, with it giving a decent life leech at 1 charge, that same amount of leech, but this time for life and mana at 2 charges, and then doubling the leech amounts at 3 charges, while still giving the 50% attack rating boost per charge of other martial arts skills. The problem is, while Cobra Strike can get the highest effective leech in the game, it's just not that useful to overload on it, especially if overloading on it requires multiple charge up hits beforehand. It can be used in a pinch to top yourself up by charging up and tapping the leechable enemy with it, much like flashing Redemption on a paladin. But it's not going to be a mainstay of any build as far as what you want to charge up with on a regular basis, since leech just doesn't provide enough utility as long as you have basic leech on your normal gear, which most melee characters do. Our third charging skill on the flip side is the exact opposite. It's one of the most popular charge skills in the game, and that is Phoenix Strike, which packs fire, ice, and lightning all in one nice standalone package. The only drawback being you generally have to focus a lot of points on its synergies to make it truly as dynamic as it sounds, so you'll usually find people choosing 2 of the elemental claw charges to push to 20, so you at least have 2 of the elements in a favorable state, and each of them have their own pros and cons, especially since there are next delay effects on both the lightning and cold effect, meaning you get a lot of damage out of it. You'll generally have to wait for the lightning to loop back around just a few frames after the ice effect. As with the other charge skills, you get attack rating for each charge, but it's half as much as the others, with only 25% at 1 charge, 50% at 2, and 75% at 3. But it also packs some pretty gnarly skills, with your single charge dropping a meteor on the target, your second charge unleashing a lightning storm of sorts that fills much of the screen while looping back in on itself, and finally the third charge providing what amounts to an off-brand frozen orb, which instead of unleashing a ball, unleashes a flurry of curving spikes. Similar to the other elemental skills, plus percent skill damage does not apply to these effects, which is unfortunate, but they're still fun to use. The 2 main strategies for this post 2.4 era are to either charge up and unleash all 3 charges with a Dragon Talon series, or use it with claws and go for the Dragon Flight and Dragon Talon combo to again release all 3 effects in quick order, but this time against a target you really want to kill. It is important to note for these that since these are designed to be used with normal weapons, not just claws, if you are using dual claws, it will only charge up the ability by swinging your main claw. The secondary claw will be fairly useless to the ordeal, which will take some getting used to if you prefer running dual claws with fire, cold, and lightning charge effects on the left, but it's still pretty serviceable. So, which charge skills do you use? Are you a claw fiend and use the ones that are on screen now, or do you prefer sword and board like we were talking about in this episode? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to those of you that support the channel directly through memberships and Patreon, as well as those of you that pick up games off of Humble Bundle using the referral link. It helps out more than you could ever realize. We've covered the traps, the shadow skills, and even the charges available to the assassin in Diablo 2. So today we deliver the finishing blow with the last 4 assassin skills: Dragon Talon, Dragon Claw, Dragon Tail, and Dragon Flight. The finishing moves that have some interesting perks and mechanics that are ripe for your exploitation. Starting at the top with the most popular of the moves, we have Dragon Talon, the multi-kick attack, or essentially jab but with your feet. The Dragon Talon, as most kicks, has some weird things to take into account while you're using it, such as while your base damage is determined by the boots you wear, the range and speed of your kick attacks are determined by the range and speed of your weapon in hand. So you do want to use a fast weapon, and if you can pull it off, one with an okay range adder too. The most common use of Dragon Talon is to either combine it with the chance to cast skills like the ever popular Riftsin, or to combo it into a charge up skill such as Phoenix Strike to unleash all 3 charges in extremely quick succession, faster than any normal attack can. This is because while Dragon Talon does benefit from item boosts and auras, it actually does not get the benefits you would expect on attacks, with things like Grief's damage plus, or even normal plus minimum or maximum damage being useless. Enhanced damage to demons or undead is completely ignored as well, and things such as Claw Mastery, Critical Strike, or even Deadly Strike are not going to help the damage output either. So you need these off damage effects to augment it basically. This means stacking Chance to Cast, Crushing Blow, and elemental damage effects to really get the most out of many of the kick skills. Now, one skill that does not suffer from this frustrating reality is the only non-kick skill in the finishing moves, Dragon Claw, which is special in that it itself instead requires wielding dual claws to actually use. This skill sadly does not really have much that makes it stand out outside of that though, since it's essentially a 2-strike attack with claws in quick succession in a manner that behaves pretty much exactly like the Barbarian Double Swing, just more weapon limited. With 2.4, this is good for releasing 2 charges though, and makes it a not uncommon pairing with Dragonflight to knock out all 3 charges on a specific target, though you do get a lot less flexibility due to its restriction to claws. Third up, we return to playing footsie with the enemy faces, this time with the more mechanically complex kick, Dragon Tail. And I'll say right now, if you come from playing other classes, this skill will not behave how you expect. This is because it obeys its own, weirdly specific set of rules. Like Dragon Talon, its base damage is determined by boots, its range and speed are determined by your weapon, but the weirdness starts happening when we talk about the Dragon Talon's special effect, a fire explosion with knockback. This is because the radial fire damage, instead of being based on your outgoing damage, is instead determined by the damage you deal to the target. So, for example, if you kick something with 0 physical resistances, your radial fire damage will behave how you would normally expect, dealing that percent of your damage as fire and knocking stuff back. But where you'll notice the quirk is when you kick a physical immune enemy. You'll notice that the fire damage will do nothing. That's right, if you do 0 physical damage, the fire effect will deal 0 damage, since any percent times 0 will be, well, 0. Similarly, if you convert a lot of your damage to another element, for example with Fists of Fire charges, you'll greatly reduce your Dragon Talon damage since you're no longer dealing much physical at all. That said, this can be used to your advantage though when you know about it. Since you have the ability to greatly enhance your physical damage with skills like Tiger Strike, you can lower enemy physical resist with curses like Amplified Damage, and you can even pump up the fire damage of the skill more since it does work with enhanced fire damage effects, which means you get the ability to stack percents rather than just adding them together like most attacks. Though, don't forget, Dragon Tail does suffer from the kick limitations mentioned on Dragon Talon, so definitely think twice about what modifiers you go for on your equipment. The last and more utility-focused skill in the finishing moveset is the one that is a little less incentivized with 2.4, and that is Dragonflight. Before 2.4, it was a solid finisher since you would use all your charges on 1 strike regardless. Now it's relegated to being just a decent finisher that is used mostly to reposition you, your mercenary, and your shadow in a fight. And while it follows pretty much the same rules as the other kick skills, there is one exception. Dragonflight has a fixed animation length that cannot be improved. So whether you have great or terrible attack speed, cast speed, or whatever, it will still be a relatively slow attack. The big nice thing about the skill though is that it gives you a lot more mobility without needing to rely on items like Enigma or risk lowering your defense by just running to a situation, since while teleporting you are still considered stationary, so your defense and block are unaffected. And since you can reposition with it, you can use it to pinpoint your primary target a lot easier than with other finishing skills. And it has given rise to the Dragonflight into Dragon Talon combo to fully release charges or even Dragon Claw if you're using dual claw. And while this is not my favorite, there are quite a few seasoned players that swear by it. I just find it a little hotkey heavy for my personal tastes. So, what is your favorite finishing move, and which charges do you use with it? Mention it down below, and if you need a refresher on those charges, check out the links on screen now, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye.